So I'm going to talk a little bit about Port Everglades. And by the way, we did Port Everglades TradeNumbers last year for the first time, and it was the first time we'd ever done a trade publication for a specific seaport. So that's, I'm grateful for Port Everglades, for Ellen and Steve and the whole team at Port Everglades for getting behind this and allowing us to do this for the first time. And we are now back for the second year launching the event. Who was here last year for this event? Were some of you here last year? So a number of you were here last year. And you came back for more punishment. Good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this publication, and I'll answer any questions you have. I'll walk you through a quick PowerPoint presentation. I'll show you our website. On our website, every month we upload more than 6,000 pages of data on every airport, seaport, border crossing, more than 200 countries, and more than 1,800 different exports and imports and how they're traded. It's all hyperlinked and interactive, and again, updated every month. So first of all, there's and it's a particularly interesting quote to use today, but there's an old British expression, we are cursed to live in interesting times. And as most of you know, Britain pulled out of the EU. But I say this because who knows who the #1 U.S. trade partner is? Anybody know? Oh, and the people of WorldCity can't answer. And I want a quick introduction of my two WorldCity people here. Tatiana Penzardi and Sari Govantis are here from WorldCity as well. Man, you got a bigger round of applause than I did. They've heard me speak. Who's the #1 trade partner for the U.S.? It's got Canada there. So for every year until last year, it was Canada. And now it's China. And before you think, oh, it's those Chinese and their cheap imports, that's not what's going on at all. It's the Canadians and the value of oil. Canada is the #1 supplier of foreign oil to this country. For the first time in 2014, they had supplied more than 20% of all U.S. oil that was imported. And as we know, the price of oil is going down, down, down. I was talking before the event about how 10 years ago we were convinced that with India and China and the developing world coming online, that commodity prices were going to shoot through the roof and just be uncontrollable. Turns out we were exactly wrong. Commodity prices have hit the floor, and so now we're all very happy because we pay so little at the pump, relatively speaking, for gasoline, but it affects seaports all over the country who are either exporting gasoline or importing gasoline, or in the import-export of energy and so forth. And one of those is Port Everglades. So the other change that occurred last year, China passed Canada because of the drop in oil. The largest trade surplus of any customs district in the country historically has been Miami. The Miami Customs District includes Port Everglades. Last year it was somebody else. Anybody know who that was? Who has the largest trade surplus of any customs district in the country? Houston. Houston, Texas. Houston used to have an enormous trade deficit because of all that oil they had to import. But now, because of fracking, and because we now can export oil, Houston has the nation's largest trade surplus. The other thing that happened is oil fell so far that motor vehicles, for the first time in, I don't know, a dozen years or so, were the #1 import in the U.S. So against that backdrop, we're going to talk about Port Everglades trade numbers, because trade at Port Everglades fell last year, and it fell principally for the reason that we've been talking about, which is the price of, in this case, gasoline. So let me get my clicker. And by the way, if anybody has any questions at any time, just raise your hand, ask the question, I'll be happy to answer it for you. So here's 10 2015 highlights, 10 things to know. And by the way, the publication in front of you is organized in a very simple fashion. The first section is the countries. Who are the top 20 trade partners that trade with Port Everglades? The second section is the top 10 exports, and the third section is the top 10 imports. And it's got lots of pictures and it's colorful, so it's pretty easy to look at. So there's Port Everglades. After a 4 record year, Port Everglades trade fell 7.14%. U.S. trade fell last year for the first time in more than 2 decades without a major external shock. The previous times it had fallen was after September 11th in 2001 and in 2009 after the global economic crisis. Last year, U.S. trade fell and there was no big crisis, right? It was just the price of oil. After a decade at #1, Venezuela fell to rank as Port Everglades' 3rd most important trade partner. And again, that's about gasoline. Okay? South Korea now provides more gasoline through Port Everglades. Question? Somebody has a question?
I just wanted to point out the value of the goods.
Great question. Great question. So their question is, how is this trade measured? I was in a discussion recently with a couple of guys. We were sitting there talking, and one guy's talking about his trade, and he was from a seaport, and the other guy was from an air cargo line, and he's talking about his trade, and I'm sitting there talking about trade as well. And I'm talking dollars, the air cargo guy's talking tonnage, and the port guy's talking containers. So we're all talking about trade, but we're talking sort of a different language, if you will. Everything you see in this publication, for the most part, there is some tonnage information in there, but most of what you see in this publication is dollar value. It's all from the U.S. Census Department, so I appreciate that question. Tonnage at the port last year was up 0.8%. So the port brought in more revenues, even though the value was down, okay? So to them, they don't really care about the value. It's nice, it's important, and when it's going up, it sounds great. But the way the port drives revenue is through the weight of those goods. So. And there's the value of refined petroleum. You can see it right there, from 3.43 billion to 2.27 billion. That's a big drop. Here's a comment.
Neil Kachura, responsible for the petroleum business unit. And just a comment to address the question. Petroleum, as you can see, there was a 50% fall in how much a barrel was in the last 12 months, roughly. But Port Everglades, in terms of volume, we moved about 5% more in volume of petroleum, and we also realized an 8% increase in net revenue to the port on those movements. So yeah, it is. Do you talk about, as Ken said, do you talk about containers, do you talk about tons, do you talk about barrels, or do you talk about dollars? And this is about dollars.
So how many of you are driving less than you were a year ago? We're all driving the same amount. We're just paying less at the pump, and we're happy to be paying less at the pump, right? So this shows the nation's leading trade partners. The nation's leading ports. Port Everglades ranks 14th in the nation. This is an overall quick look at exports. Were down 2.87%. The imports, again, that's driven by the refined petroleum, down 11.45%. Port Everglades is somewhat unusual in another way. It runs a trade surplus year in, year out. Most seaports, if you look where the nation has deficits and surpluses, you're more likely to see a surplus at an airport than a seaport. And that's because seaports traditionally handle low-value, high-weight goods. Airports tend to handle high-value, low-weight goods. Fastest growing trade partner, Germany. And I can tell you why, or you can look at your publication and figure out why. But the fastest growing trade partner was Germany. Its trade with the port grew 71%, almost 72%. Went from number 32 to number 18 and entered the publication. The biggest drop was Costa Rica, which went from number 4 to number 16. Trade fell more than 2/3. And again, there's pages on both those in the publication. They probably have to do with changing trade lanes. These are 8 flags of the 8 countries that the port does $1 billion in trade with. So the port has 8 countries where there's $1 billion in trade, and that's the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Venezuela, which we've talked about. Those are 1, 2, and 3. Then there's Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Guatemala. And to Steve's point, a lot of north-south trade in there, as you can see from those countries. One of Port Everglades' top 10 exports set a record in 2015. It's something we all have in our pockets, hopefully on silent mode. Cell phones, up 98%, almost 20%. Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago in this country, the value of cell phone imports passed the value of computer imports. And it shows the change in how we're living our lives, right? Our cell phone has become more important to us in many cases than our computer. 5 of the top 10 imports set records. T-shirts. South Florida is one of the leading gateways for T-shirt imports, largely from Honduras and Central America. The other leading gateway is going to be Los Angeles, and those are coming from Asia. And there's sort of a back and forth battle of who's going to be the T-shirt king. Another one that set records, yachts. How many bought a yacht last year? Anybody buy a yacht? Okay, nobody willing to admit that. And then granite and tile, cigars, cigarettes, and then socks and pantyhose. And those are mainly cigars. I heard somebody say cigarettes. Those are mainly cigars. So I looked at the top 25 trade partners and said, of those top 25 trade partners, which ones have showed the most consistent growth over 10 years, 5 years, and 2 years? And that's the trade partner that appeared on that list on all three. Who knows who that is? Somebody got it. Trinidad. How about that one? Dominican Republic? How about that one? There's a little tougher one. Uruguay. There you go. So those are the three countries that if you look at over the last 10, 5, and 2 years have appeared in the top 10 that whole time in terms of by percentage growth. 4 nations were among the top 10 for the fastest growth. Now, the first set was in percentage growth. This is in dollar value. So you're going to see some similar flags. That's the Dominican Republic, Trinidad. How about that one? Who knows that one? Honduras. How about that one? Peru. So in terms of dollar value, those are the 4 countries that over the last 10 years, 5 years, and 2 years have appeared in the top 10 consistently. Top performing exports. So 4 of the top 25 exports have appeared in the top 10 over 10 years, 5 years, and 2 years. Cell phones again. Now, you may say, wait a minute, we export cell phones? I didn't know we made cell phones in this country, right? We don't make cell phones in this country. But we export a lot of cell phones from South Florida. In fact, South Florida leads the nation in the export of cell phones because, as many of us in the room know, we are the shopping cart for Latin America here. So much of what we export here goes to Latin America. So they're coming to the U.S., usually from China or somewhere like that, and sometimes there's value added and they're re-exported. The other thing is pumps for dispensing liquids, and that can be things like centrifugal pumps. And as near as I can tell, those are going to be things like pool pumps and things like that, all sorts of pumps like that. And then taps, cocks, and valves, and that would include things like thermostats. Those are big exports. Those are things that, if you look at the top 25 exports, and you say which have grown most consistently over 10, 5, and 2 years in terms of percentage, those are the ones. And you can add to that electrical supplies. Now, if you look at dollar value growth, you got 2 exports. One is cotton, and that cotton yarn, and that's going to be going to Central America for all those t-shirts and socks. If you get home at the end of the day today, don't do it now, please, and you take your clothes off, you'll find that very little that you have on, I would guarantee you nothing you have on is made in this country. But very little that you have on will not have come from Asia. But it's quite possible, particularly if you're a man, that your t-shirt, your underwear, your socks might have come from Central America. And the other thing is cell phones. So cell phones are big in dollar value and they're big in percentage growth over time. Now we're going to go to the import side quickly. 4 of the top 25 imports ranked in the top 10 over the 10, 5, and 2 year periods. Electrical supplies. Who knows what that one is? Can you tell what that is? Perfume. A lot of perfume brought into Port Everglades. Yachts. We talked about yachts before. Insulated wire and cable. Now what about, and I'm done. So there you go. So if you have any questions, I'll answer them. But